For more, we are joined by Simon Tay, chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Simon, good morning. I mean, the latest attack by the military government seems to have intensified pressure on ASEAN to do more to stop the violence in the country. Now, the bloc did strongly condemn the attack, but can and should they do more?
That's a very important question, Julie. It's clearly, this is an escalation of violence, reprehensible, indiscriminate killing of children and civilians who were gathered there. And the important part to understand is that this marks an escalation, not just a simple continuation of the ongoing violence since the coup. And secondly, that this also was an occasion where the civilians were gathered to start another People's Defense Force, so reports are. In other words, both sides, both the military SAC and the civilians, continue to escalate their conflict. In this sense, I mean, the fundamental analysis for ASEAN or any mediator is that if both sides are unwilling to even think of compromise to lessen the violence, there is a severe limit of what any outsider can do.
Yeah, Simon, if we zoom out for a moment, Russia and China blocked the UN Security Council from issuing a British drafted statement condemning the recent airstrike in Sagaing. They say there is conflicting information on the circumstances of the attack in question. Do they have a point, or is this more of a political play that just highlights the limitations of international intervention?
Well, Steve, it's a good question. I think that efforts were made earlier to bring Russia and China on board. In the earlier resolution, at least they abstained rather than negating it. Here, they're playing, about the facts. Now, I did say that some reports are that there was a PDF, a People's Defense Force, being inaugurated. But it must be very clear that whatever was happening on the ground in that village does not merit such an indiscriminate and out of proportion attack. And so really, I cannot understand, except for politics, why Russia and China are staying on the negative side. But this means that the UN Security Council, ideally placed to act, is unable to act. And that's why I think the pressure is mounting to find a solution. But honestly, ASEAN, while it owns the problem, can only do so much. There are so many other players like Russia and China who, if not on board, really there can be no solution found.
Speaking of solutions, Simon, sanctions statements have so far seemed to have failed in stopping the violence in Myanmar. Will there be new calls to stop the flow of jet fuels or weapons to the military government yield any tangible results?
Yeah, I think there is a frustration with both this incident and the length of violence and ongoing problems. You're starting to see a real division of views about the use of sanctions. One is that we should actually stop them. And among some ASEAN people, they're actually talking about how to begin to really talk to the military. Now, that's been growing the last few months. But the question now is whether this will continue or whether this incident, should actually stop such talk about trying to deal legitimately with the military. And the other talk of increasing sanctions, finance, aviation fuel, to starve the whole country, including the generals, that's increasing. ASEAN has strongly condemned this and is setting us up middle ground. That 5-point consensus, though people berate it, remains the essential baseline for any kind of solution. I think one new attempt must be made to bring on board China, Japan, South Korea even, anyone with a border, investments, and therefore some suasion on the military and on the other actors on the ground in Myanmar. This is perhaps something that should be tried by ASEAN as we move forward with this very difficult and prolonged problem.
So how do you assess the grip on power in Myanmar that the military have then with these sort of ongoing attacks and sort of military operations? They had talked about or promised, in fact, elections later this year. Do you see that as unlikely now?
Well, I think that this shows that Sagaing, which is normally a Burmese area, very near the Mandalay, it's not a border area with a great history of conflict. This should have been quite settled in the old days. So this is really an example of how the post-coup resistance continues to really be very strong and more organized. So I would say that the chance of any kind of legitimate election, I'm not just talking about something that is a charade, a legitimate election, is going more distant. Some people also suggest that this heinous act really shows that the military is bordering on almost desperation, striking on the ground, whereas a more confident military would have struck on the ground. This is really distant shots taken from the air against a civilian population.
And Simon, let's say, if the election does take place, what's likely to be the outcome now with the NLD dissolved, its leadership still imprisoned? Will it allow the military to take full control of the country's politics, or perhaps share its power with its own proxy party, the USDP?
I think there are two issues here: the power of legitimate power to govern and the power on the ground to really settle things. If I start with the second one, do the military really have full control over all the major areas of Myanmar? I think today the answer is less so than before the coup. There is no strong consensus of who really is going to continue. Some people feel that this act will actually continue to stir the anger among the population. The elections might try to cast some sense of legitimacy on the first question of who is known to be the government. But honestly, in these circumstances, and if it proceeds too quickly after this election won't legitimize anyone. It will be seen to be a sham, especially with the NLD, which was the elected government before this, completely now set to sort of on the sidelines, being classified as illegal.
And Simon, what should we be looking
So
out for?
I don't think that really the solutions are something to rush for or to find really a solution through the elections.
And what should we be looking out for that will tell us sort of which way is sort of headed next? We know the ASEAN meeting is in May.
The Indonesian government, the chairman of ASEAN at the moment, has been proactive. They're very strongly democratic. But I am hoping that in the run-up to the May election, they will galvanize not only the pro-democracy forces, especially from the West, but also reach out to more conciliatory forces in Thailand to keep ASEAN unified, on track, and also to deal with partners like in China, Japan, who will come to the May meeting after ASEAN ministers meet. May, June, they'll meet. And hopefully we'll try and get a chorus of different viewpoints, not all unified, but to tell the military at the very least that if they want to find peace, they cannot, in the sense, wage war against the civilians at this level that we saw in Sagaing.
Good, Simon. Thank you very much for insight this morning. Simon Tay, chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs.
Thank you, Julie.